Hello, it's Grandma. I have another chapter for you from Little House in the Big Woods, and this is about the dance at Grandpa's. You can see there's a little picture here of people dancing. So Monday morning, everybody got up early in a hurry to get started to Grandpa's. Pa wanted to be there to help with the work of gathering and boiling the sap. Ma would help Grandma and the aunts make good things to eat for all the people who were coming to the dance. So breakfast was eaten, the dishes washed, and the beds made by lamplight. Pa packed his fiddle carefully in its box and put it in the big sled that was already waiting at the gate. The air was cold and frosty, and the light was gray, and Laura and Mary and Ma and baby Carrie were tucked in snug and warm under the robes on the straw in the bottom of the sled. The horses shook their heads and pranced, making the sleigh bells ring merrily, and away they went on the road through the big woods to Grandpa's. The snow was damp and smooth in the road, and the sled slipped quickly over it, and the big trees seemed to be hurrying by on either side. After a while there was sunshine in the woods, and the air sparkled. The long streaks of yellow light lay between the shadows of the tree trunks, and the snow was faintly colored pink. All the shadows were thin and blue, and every little curve of snowdrift and every little track in the snow had a shadow. Pa showed Laura the tracks of the wild creatures in the snow at the side of the road. The small leaping tracks of cottontail rabbits, the tiny tracks of field mice, the feather-stitching tracks of snowbirds. There were larger tracks, like dogs' tracks, where the fox had run, and there were tracks of a deer that had bounded away into the woods. The air was growing warmer already, and Pa said that the snow wouldn't last long. It did not seem long until they were sweeping into the clearing at Grandpa's house, all the sleigh bells jingling. Grandma came to the door and stood there smiling, calling them to come in. She said that Grandpa and Uncle George were already at work in the maple woods. So Pa went to help them, and Laura and Mary and Ma, with baby Carrie in her arms, went into Grandma's house and took off their wraps. Laura loved Grandma's house. It was much larger than their house at home. There was one big great room, and there was a little room that belonged to Uncle George, and there was another room for their aunts, Aunt Docia and Aunt Ruby. And there was a kitchen with a big cook stove. It was fun to run the whole length of the big room, with a large fireplace on one end of the way to Grandma's bed under the window in the other end. The floor was made of wide, thick slabs that Grandpa had hewn from logs with his axe. The floor was smoothed all over and scrubbed clean and white, and the bed under the window was soft with feathers. The day seemed very short while Laura and Mary played in the big room, and Ma helped Grandma and the aunts in the kitchen. The men had taken their dinners to the maple wood, so for dinner they did not set the table, but ate cold venison sandwiches and drank milk. But for supper Grandma made hasty pudding. She stood by the stove, sifting the yellow cornmeal from her fingers into a kettle of boiling salted water. She stirred the water all that time with a big wooden spoon and sifted in the meal until the kettle was full of a thick, yellow, bubbling mass. Then she set it on the back of the stove where it would cook slowly. It smelled so good. The whole house smelled good, with the sweet and spicy smells from the kitchen, and the smell of the hickory logs burning in the clear bright flames in the fireplace, and the smell of a clove apple besides Grandma's mending basket on the table. The sunshine came in through sparkling window panes, and everything was large and spacious and clean. At supper time Pa and Grandpa came from the woods. Each had on his shoulders a wooden yoke that Grandpa had made. It was cut to fit around their necks in the back and hollowed out to fit over their shoulders. From each end hung a chain with a hook, and on each hook hung a big wooden bucket full of hot maple syrup. Pa and Grandpa had brought the syrup from the big kettle in the woods. They steadied the bucket with their hands, but the weight hung from the yoke on their shoulders. Now here's a picture of Grandpa with the yoke. Oh, I guess it's kind of blurry. Anyway, this Grandpa with the yoke on his shoulders, and you can see the chains with the buckets hanging off. Grandma made room for the big brass kettle on the stove. Pa and Grandpa poured the syrup into the brass kettle, and it was so large that it held all the syrup from the 4 big buckets. Then Uncle George came in with a smaller bucket of syrup, and everybody ate the hot, hasty pudding with maple syrup for supper. That sounds good. Uncle George was home from the army. He wore his blue army coat with the big brass buttons, and he had bold, merry eyes. He was big and broad, and he walked with a swagger. Laura looked at him all the time she was eating her hasty pudding, because she had heard Pa say to Ma that he was wild. "George is wild since he came back from the war," Pa said, shaking his head as if he was sorry, but it couldn't be helped. Uncle George had run away to be a drummer boy in the army when he was 14 years old. Laura had never seen a wild man before. She did not know if she was afraid of Uncle George or not. When supper was over, Uncle George went outside the door, and he blew his army bugle long and loud. It made a lovely ringing sound far away in the big woods. The woods were dark and silent, and the trees stood still as if they were listening. Then from very far away the sound came back, thin and clear and small, like a little bugle answering the big one. "Listen," Uncle George said. "Isn't that pretty?" Laura looked at him, but she did not say anything, and Uncle George stopped blowing the bugle, and she ran into the house. Ma and Grandma cleared away the dishes and washed them and swept the hearth, while Aunt Docia and Aunt Ruby made themselves pretty in their room. Laura sat on their bed and watched them comb out their long hair and part it carefully. They parted it from their foreheads to the napes of their necks, and they parted it from ear to ear. They braided their long hair up back in braids, and they did the braids up carefully in big knots. They washed their hands and faces and scrubbed them well with soap at the wash basin and the bench in the kitchen. They used store soap, not the slimy, soft, dark brown soap that Grandma made and kept in a big jar to use for common every day. They fussed for a long time with their front hair, holding up the lamp and looking at the hair in the little looking glass that hung on the log wall. They brushed it so smooth on each side of the straight white part that it shone like silk in the lamplight. The little puff on each side shone too, and the ends were coiled and twisted neatly away under the big knot in back. Then they pulled on their big, beautiful white stockings that they had knit of fine cotton thread in lacy open-work patterns, and they buttoned up their best shoes. They helped each other with their corsets. Aunt Docia pulled as hard as she could on Aunt Ruby's corset strings, and Aunt Docia hung on the foot of the bed while Aunt Ruby pulled on hers. "Pull, Ruby, pull!" said Docia, breathless. "Pull harder!" So Ruby braced her feet and pulled harder. Aunt Docia kept measuring her waist with her hands, and at last she gasped, "Oh, I guess that's the best you can do." Then she said, "Caroline says Charles could span her waist with his hands when they were married." Caroline was Laura's ma. When she heard that, Laura felt proud. So then Aunt Ruby and Aunt Docia put on their flannel petticoats, and their plain petticoats, and their starched, stiff white petticoats with the knitted lace all around the flounces, and then they put on their beautiful dresses. Aunt Docia's dress was a sprigged print, dark blue with sprigs of red flowers and green leaves thick upon it. The basque was buttoned down the front with big black buttons that looked so much like juicy big blackberries that Laura wanted to taste them. Aunt Ruby's dress was a wine-colored calico, covered all over with a feathery pattern in a light wine color. It was buttoned with gold buttons down the front, and every button had a little castle and a tree carved on it. Aunt Docia's pretty white collar was fastened in front with a large cameo pin, which had a lady's head on it. But Aunt Ruby had pinned her collar with a red rose made of sealing wax. She had made it herself on the head of a darning needle which had a broken eye, so it couldn't be used as an eye anymore. They looked lovely sailing over the floor so smoothly with their large round skirts. Their little waists rose up tight and slender in the middle, and their cheeks were red and their eyes were bright under the wings of shining, sleek hair. Ma was beautiful too, in her dark green delaine, with little leaves that looked like strawberries scattered all over it. The skirt was ruffled and flounced and draped and trimmed with knots of dark green ribbon. Nestling at her throat was a gold pin. The pin was flat, as long and as wide as Laura's two biggest fingers, and it was carved all over and scalloped on the edges. Ma looked so rich and fine that Laura was afraid to touch her. People had begun to come. They were coming on foot through the snowy woods with their lanterns, and they were driving up to the door in sleds and wagons. Sleigh bells were jingling all that time. The big room was filled with tall boots and swishing skirts, and ever so many babies were lying in rows on Grandma's bed. Uncle James and Aunt Libby had come with their little girl, whose name was Laura Ingalls, too. The two Lauras leaned on the bed and looked at the babies, and the other Laura said that her baby was prettier than baby Carrie. "She is not either," said Laura. "Carrie's the prettiest baby in the whole world." "No, she isn't," the other Laura said. "Yes, she is." "No, she isn't." Ma came sailing over with her fine delaine and said severely, "Laura!" So neither Laura said anything any more. Uncle George was blowing his bugle. It made a loud ringing sound in the big room, and Uncle George danced and joked and laughed. Blowing his bugle. Here's a picture of Uncle George blowing his bugle. Then Pa took his fiddle out of the box and began to play, and all the couples stood in squares on the floor and began to dance when Pa cut the figures. "Grand right and left," Paul called out, and all the skirts began to swirl and the boots began to stamp. The circles went round and round, and all the skirts going one way and all the boots going the other, and the hands clasping and parting high in the air. "Swing your partners," Pa called. "Each gent bow to the lady on the left." And they all did as Pa said. Laura watched Ma's skirt swaying and her little waist bending and her dark head bowing, and she thought Ma was the loveliest dancer in the world. And the fiddle was singing, "Oh, you Buffalo gals, aren't you coming out tonight? Aren't you coming out tonight? Aren't you coming out tonight? Oh, you Buffalo gals, aren't you coming out tonight to dance by the light of the moon?" The little circles and the big circles went around and around, and the skirts swirled, and the boots stamped, and the partners bowed and separated and met and bowed again. In the kitchen, Grandma was all by herself, stirring the boiling syrup in the big brass kettle. She stirred in time to the music. By the back door was a pail of clean snow, and sometimes Grandma took a spoonful of syrup from the kettle and poured some of it on the snow in a saucer. Laura watched the dancers again. Pa was playing the Irish washerwoman now, and he said, "Do-si-do, ladies, do-si-do, come down heavy on your heel and toe." Laura could not keep her feet still. Uncle George looked at her and laughed, and he caught her by the hands and did a little dance with her in the corner. She liked Uncle George. Everybody was laughing over by the kitchen door, and they were dragging Grandma in from the kitchen. Grandma's dress was beautiful, too, a dark blue calico with autumn-colored leaves scattered all over it. Her cheeks were pink from laughing, and she was shaking her head. The wooden spoon was in her hand. Now here is a big picture of the dance. And there in the middle you can see Laura dancing with Uncle George. "I can't leave the syrup," she said. But Pa began to play the Arkansas Traveler, and everybody began to clap in time to the music. So Grandma bowed to them all and did a few steps by herself. She could dance as prettily as any of them. Clapping sound almost drowned out the music of Pa's fiddle. Suddenly, Uncle George did a pigeon wing, and bowing low before Grandma, he began to jig. Grandma tossed her spoon to somebody, and she put her hands on her hips, and she faced Uncle George, and everybody shouted. Grandma was jigging. Well, Laura clapped her hands in time to the music with all the other clapping hands, and the fiddle sang out as it had never sung before, and Grandma's eyes were snapping and her cheeks were red, and underneath her skirts her heels were clicking as fast as the thumping of Uncle George's boots. Everybody was excited. Uncle George kept jigging, and Grandma kept facing him jigging too, and the fiddle did not stop. Uncle George began to breathe loudly and swept the sweat off of his forehead, and Grandma's eyes twinkled. "You can't beat her, George!" somebody shouted. Uncle George jigged faster. He jigged twice as fast as he had been jigging, and so did Grandma. Everybody cheered again. All the women were laughing and clapping their hands, and all the men were teasing George. George did not care, but he did not have the breath to laugh. He was jigging. Pa's blue eyes were snapping and sparkling, and he was standing up watching George and Grandma, and the bow danced over the fiddle strings, and Laura jumped up and down and squealed and clapped her hands. Grandma kept on jigging, and her hands were on her hips, and her chin was up, and she was smiling. George kept jigging, but his boots did not thump as loudly as they had thumped at first. Grandma's heels kept on clacking gaily, and a drop of sweat dripped off of George's forehead and shone on his cheek. All at once he threw up both arms and gasped, "I'm beat!" He stopped jigging. Everybody made a terrific noise, and shouting and yelling and stamping and cheering Grandma. Grandma jigged for a little minute more, and then she stopped. She laughed in gasps. Her eyes sparkled just like Pa's when he laughed. George was laughing too, and wiping his forehead on his sleeve. Suddenly Grandma stopped laughing. She turned and ran as fast as she could to the kitchen. The fiddle had stopped playing, and all the women were talking at once, and the men were teasing George, but everyone was still for a minute when Grandma looked like that. She came to the door in between the kitchen and the big room, and she said, "The syrup is waxing. Come help yourselves." So everyone began to laugh and talk again. They went to the kitchen for plates, and outdoors to fill their plates of snow. And the kitchen door was open, and the cold air came in. Outdoors, the stars were frosty in the sky, and the air nipped Laura's cheeks and nose. Her breath was like smoke. She and the other Laura and all of the other children scooped up clean snow with their plates, and they went back into the crowded kitchen. Grandma stood by the big brass kettle with a big wooden spoon, and she poured hot syrup on each plate of snow. It cooled into soft candy, and as fast as it cooled they ate it. They could eat all they wanted, for maple sugar never hurt anybody. There was plenty of syrup in the kettle and plenty of snow outdoors, and as soon as they ate one plateful, they filled their plates of snow again, and Grandma poured more syrup on it. When they had eaten the soft maple candy until they could not eat any more of it, then they helped themselves from the long table loaded with pumpkin pies and dried berry pies and cookies and cakes. There was salt rising bread, too, and cold boiled pork and pickles. Oh, how sour the pickles were! And then they ate till they could hold no more, and then they began to dance again. But Grandma watched the syrup in the kettle. Many times she took a little bit of it out of a saucer and stirred it around and around, and then she shook her head and poured the syrup back into the kettle. The other room was loud and merry with the music of the fiddle and the noise of the dancing. At last Grandma stirred, and the syrup in the saucer turned into little grains like sand, and Grandma called, "Quick, girls, it's greening!" So Aunt Ruby and Aunt Docia and Ma left the dance and came running. They set out pans, big pans, little pans, and as fast as Grandma filled them with the syrup, they set out more. They set the filled ones away to cool into maple sugar. Then Grandma said, "Now bring the patty pans for the children." There was a patty pan, or at least a broken cup or saucer, for every little girl and boy. They all watched anxiously while Grandma ladled out the syrup. Maybe there would not be enough. Then somebody would have to be unselfish and polite. But there was just enough syrup to go around. The last scrapings of the brass kettle exactly filled the last patty pan. Nobody was left out. The fiddling and dancing went on, and Laura and the other Laura stood around and watched the dancers. Then they sat down on the floor in a corner and watched. The dancing was so pretty and the music so gay that Laura knew she could never get tired of it. All of the beautiful skirts went swirling by, and the boots were stamping, and the fiddle kept on singing gaily. Then Laura woke up, and she was lying across the foot of Grandma's bed. It was morning. Ma and Grandma and baby Carrie were in the bed, and Pa and Grandpa were sleeping in rolled up blankets on the floor by the fireplace. Mary was nowhere in sight because she was sleeping with Aunt Docia and Aunt Ruby in their bed. Soon everyone was getting up. There was pancakes and maple syrup for breakfast, and then Pa brought the horses and sled to the door. He helped Ma and Carrie in, and while Grandpa picked up Mary, Uncle George picked up Laura, and they tossed them over the edge of the sled into the straw. And Pa tucked in the robes around them, and Grandma and Grandpa and Uncle George stood by waving "Goodbye, goodbye," as they rode into the big woods going home. The sun was warm, and the trotting horses flew up bits of muddy snow with their hoofs. Behind the sled Laura could see their footprints, and every footprint went through the thin snow into the mud. Before night, Pa said, "We'll see the last of the sugar snow." Well, that's the end of that chapter, and the next chapter is about going to town. And that one's very interesting because Laura and Mary had not been to town before, so we'll have to hear about going to town. All right, I'll see you next time. Bye!